Hello class, this is your instructor. Respond to some of the questions that appear at the end of chapter 17 on juveniles in the American correctional system. Well, the first question was, how has growing up changed over the last few centuries, and how are these changes related to juvenile justice? Well, one of the major changes is that children no longer are seen as just small-bodied adults, which they used to be. The picture on the right shows children, many of them younger than 15 years of age, working in a mine in Pittston, Pennsylvania. And so you can see some of the changes in attitudes and relationships to juvenile delinquency, also in changes in child labor laws. And so as we started changing our views of children as being something other than just small-bodied adults with regard to labor, some of this also bled into the criminal justice system. These were influencing one another. There is also broad acknowledgement now from the science of developmental psychology that the mental capacity of juveniles is just not as well developed as it is in adults. They tend to be more impulsive, they're less future-oriented, and less likely to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. And so as we age, we all tend to get a little bit better at what criminologists call self-control. We all get a little bit better at holding our horses and counting to 10 and that kind of thing, and not acting on our worst impulses. And so for that reason, we ought to think of juvenile offenders, even if they're acting in very similar ways as adults, we should think of them differently. Changes or differences between the adult and juvenile systems, one of the major ones is that juveniles tend to be treated less punitively, so less harsh of a sentence given, or the sentence is not as long, and there tends to be a greater focus on rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is front and center for the juvenile system, where it's a goal for adults as well, but not as central. The first goal for adults that have committed serious crimes is usually the safety and security of the public from whatever acts they might do in the future. So it's incarceration, or to a lesser extent than community corrections. Okay, the second question asked about differences and similarities of how juveniles and adults are treated by the criminal justice system. Well, as I stated previously, there is a greater emphasis on rehabilitation for juveniles, and also there's an acknowledgement of additional categories for children who might be at risk. And so there are neglected children, children who are abused physically, mentally, emotionally by parents and caregivers. Then the state has to step in and act as the parent, parens parente, as they say in the book. And then there's also dependent children who have no caregivers or parents that can be relied upon. And so if you read in your chapter, there were these houses of refuge that were created in the 19th century for children that were dependent to try to rid urban areas from these images that you see on the right-hand side of the screen of very young kids sleeping outside because they had nowhere else to go. And so they may start off as neglected and dependent children, but these are the same children that will end up being criminally involved if no action is taken. If they're just sort of little kids are left to their own devices, that's what tends to happen. They're similar also in the sense that crimes committed by juveniles and crimes committed by adults, they're both weighed in terms of their seriousness as well as past behavior is taken into account. Okay, jumping to the fourth question, because the third question was just about differences in terminology between adult and juvenile criminal justice processing, a lot of which is symbolic. The fourth question, though, is about how are juvenile correctional facilities different from adult facilities? Well, one of the main things that you will notice, and I have firsthand experience with this because I used to work in a juvenile rehabilitation center is the emphasis on education. Most juvenile inmates have not completed high school, so they're still in their grade schools. They're still completing 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade. And so they go to school during the day, well, I would say just like, but similar to what other conventionally situated youths are doing. And so education is primary for a lot of juvenile delinquents who are incarcerated. Okay, and then the fifth question is, should we have separate systems for juveniles and adults? Well, yes, of course we should, for reasons that I already outlined above, that biologically and then therefore psychologically, children are not the same as adults because they don't have the same mental capacity to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. However, there are some rare exceptions, though, especially for violent juvenile offenders. And I'm not talking about just the average aggravated assault or attempted murder even. I'm talking about juveniles who have, for instance, abducted a girl and not only raped and beat her, but tortured her before murdering her. Now, for those type of offenders, and there's relatively few of them, only about 1% of juveniles who are petitioning get waived to the adult system, that is where I think a lot of people could make a sound moral argument that the types of privileges that are afforded to juvenile delinquents in juvenile facilities should not be afforded to people who are doing especially malicious, heinous acts to other human beings. And so while it may be that we cannot execute them, the Supreme Court has decided that, River v. Simmons, but we should leave open the possibility of bounding them over to the adult system. Now, this is especially for those who are not only violent, but were sadistic in their acts. And there are enough juvenile offenders, well, it's rare, there are enough that we have to have that possibility. And that was the logic all along of having a waiver system. Sometimes it can be abused, where you have those that are involved in violence and drugs and gang activity get waived on because they're extensive criminal records. They are profligate sinners, but that may not be appropriate for them. But I could make the argument, though, and I will, that those that are especially sadistic killers, we should consider them to be suitable to be treated as adults, and therefore they get the harsh sentences that adults deserve when they behave this way. The only main difference is that the state cannot execute them. Okay, that's it for now. Until next time, bye-bye.